In today's episode, I'll talk about two interesting stories. In the first one, I'll talk about how India's top alcohol companies are navigating complex state laws, changing drinking behavior, and also chasing premium margins all at the same time. And in the second story of the day, I'll talk about how India's solar power boom has led to electricity prices crashing to nearly zero and why that is both exciting and worrying at the same time. Welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerodha, where our aim is to cut through the noise and simplify the biggest news and stories in the financial markets in a way that is easy for all of us to understand, yet one level deeper as compared to your traditional news channels. I'm your host Anurag Bansal, and today is Monday, the 2nd of June. See, India's alcohol business is currently going through some very interesting shifts, and the latest quarterly results from three of the country's biggest liquor companies tell us a lot about what exactly is changing. Now, if you're not somebody who follows this space very closely, this might seem like there's not too much to talk about. Because after all, alcohol, at least at the face of it, seems like a very simple business because you make it, you bottle it, and you sell it. But the thing is, once you scratch the surface here, you will realize that alcohol actually sits at the intersection of three very interesting forces: consumer behavior, regulatory complexity, and shifting brand aspirations. And when all of these three things come together, you get a business that is surprisingly layered, messy, and also strategic in every sense. So let me start from the very beginning to give you good context. See, three companies recently released their earnings. United Spirits, which is one of the country's biggest hard liquor companies, United Breweries, which is known for its beer brands like Kingfisher, etc., and Radico Khaitan, which has been steadily climbing up the value ladder with a mix of mass market and premium offerings. Now, each of these three companies plays a very, very different game, but still, if you look closely a little bit, they all seem to be chasing the same goal, which is higher margins through premiumization while also going through the daily chaos of selling alcohol in India. Let's take United Spirits as an example to begin with. See, this is the company that's behind brands like McDowell's, Black Dog, and several other big name brands. For the financial year that recently ended, they saw their revenue grow by 8.6% to more than 11,600 crore rupees. Now, that's not really a massive jump, but it is definitely a healthy number. What's even more impressive is that their profits are growing even faster here. The company's EBITDA rose by 20.5% and its net profit for the year grew nearly 19%, ending at about 15,500 crore rupees. The fourth quarter was particularly strong here. The company not only grew its revenue by nearly 12%, but also managed to expand its margins quite a bit, which means it earned more money per rupee of sales. United Breweries, on the other hand, had a decent year as well. Their total revenue went up by 10% to roughly 8,900 crore rupees. EBITDA grew by 14% and their profit was up 8%. Now, the last quarter for them showed some decent numbers, but what stood out the most was their beer strategy here. See, while beer margins are usually thinner and the market is highly seasonal in general, this company is betting big on premium products like Heineken, which have seen some faster growth in the market. Now, premium beer sales, in fact, went up by 24% compared to last year's quarter, and that is a big number, especially for a company as legacy as theirs. But all that aside, if there is one standard performer in this space, it is Radico Khaitan. See, unless the other two companies which I just touched upon, which by the way already have a massive market share, Radico is still growing, but it is growing fast. Its revenues for the year jumped nearly 18% to 4,851 crore rupees. Its profit grew even faster, up by 35% for this year. And the most recent quarter was its best ever, both in terms of sales and also profitability. Their total earnings, which include not just core profits, but also other gains and losses, went up by almost 50% in a single quarter. But the big question then is, how were these companies even managing to do this? See, that is because alcohol is not a business where you can just ramp up production and expect everything to sell like in some other businesses mainly. In India especially, it is a highly regulated and politically sensitive business. Each and every state has its own rules, right from how much tax you pay to where you can sell to how the product can also be advertised. So companies also have to work much harder just so that they can stay in the game. And they have to work even harder so that they can grow. Now, what we're seeing across the board right now is that companies are trying to grow by behaving more like FMCG brands, which are the kinds of companies, by the way, that sell soap, chips, cold drinks, etc. Now, that means they are trying to get more into outlets and being available across multiple formats, running premium campaigns, building loyalty, and also creating demand through experiences instead of just pricing. But that said, unlike FMCG brands, liquor companies face some extra restrictions because they cannot advertise freely. They're also limited on how they price, and they also need state level permissions for nearly everything that they need to do. do. And that makes their channel strategy very important. For example, United Spirits is placing a lot of emphasis on what they call on-premise sales, which just basically means bars, restaurants, hotels, and any other place where people drink directly instead of taking a bottle home. You might wonder why? That is because when people are at a bar, they are more open in general to trying something new. And if they like it, they then might buy a whole bottle the next time. So the bar then basically becomes the entry point to building brand loyalty. It's almost like giving customers a free sample, except that in this case, you can charge them for it. But that said, United Breweries has a slightly different problem here. See, beer, unlike whiskey or rum, needs to be served cold. And that means the company has to think about how to keep its beers chilled, especially in places like tier 2 and tier 3 towns where cold chain infrastructure is fairly limited. So one of their big capital expenses this year is actually in fridges. They are planning to triple their spending on fridges just so that they can make sure customers always find cold beer wherever and whenever they want it. They also have to think about packaging formats. In some states, people prefer cans, while in some places they prefer bottles or something else. So the company has to basically constantly tweak its strategy depending on how people drink in each and every different region of the country. But that said, Radico on the other hand is again playing a very different game here. They are trying to build premium liquor brands in a market that has been mostly dominated by cheaper whiskeys and rums. Brands like Rampur Single Malt and Jaisalmer Gin are slowly building their own niche, and Radico here is backing them up with very smart brand associations like tying up with 5-star hotels, sponsoring golf tournaments, and even getting placed on the luxury Palace on Wheels trains. All of this essentially adds a premium to the brand, which makes it more aspirational to people. Now this, mind you, is a part of a bigger trend. Across the board, liquor companies are trying to premiumize, which is sell more expensive drinks that give them slightly better margins. The lower end of the market is already saturated in many places. In places where customers are simply looking to get drunk for cheap, it is hard to win big games. You're basically stuck in a competition on price, and beer often loses out to cheap whiskey or other forms of alcohol. And that is why stronger beers tend to sell better, because they give a faster buzz to people for less amount of money. But again, it's almost like a race to the bottom here. But that said, premium brands on the other hand bring two different advantages, and both of them are interesting. One, they earn more amount of money per bottle, and second, customers are more loyal in general. So companies are steadily now nudging their portfolio upwards. United Breweries, for example, is trying to make Heineken a bigger part of its portfolio. United Spirits is even trying to give its mass market McDowell's brand a premium makeover, where they're releasing a version called McDowell's X, which is actually a single malt. On the other hand, Radico is preparing to launch 2 new luxury brands and is even working with the government to set official quality standards for Indian single malts so that they can protect the global image. But all that aside, there is one more very interesting twist to the story. India is currently in the process of signing a deal with the UK, and one of the headline changes here is a cut in alcohol tariffs. See, today when you import whiskey or gin from the UK, you pay as much as 150% on duties. That is going to come down to 75%, which means Scotch whiskey could become much cheaper in India. And that is a big deal not just for UK brands but also for Indian companies who want to import foreign liquor, bottle it in India, and then sell it as premium offerings. United Spirits, for instance, bottles Black Dog in India using imported spirits. Lower tariffs here could give it a major cost advantage. In fact, the company has already said that it plans to pass on those savings to customers, hoping that it will increase volumes as well. Now, Radico interestingly wants to go the other way here. They'd rather hold prices and enjoy the extra margin instead of passing the benefit on to their customers. Two different strategies here, but the same goal. So all that said and done, while by the nature of it, all of this definitely sounds exciting, the real heart of this industry lies in politics. See, alcohol is one of the most heavily regulated sectors in India, and most of the power lies not with the center, but actually with individual states. Each state actually acts like its own little country over here when it comes to alcohol policies. The rules in Karnataka, for example, might be very different from those in Uttar Pradesh or in Telangana for that matter. And those rules can almost change overnight as well. And that creates a deeply unpredictable environment. For instance, United Breweries could not sell Heineken in Karnataka for a full quarter simply because they did not have the permission to manufacture it. Another example is that in Andhra Pradesh, the government had slowly tried to phase out alcohol altogether, which was a form of soft prohibition, which meant liquor companies had to pull out for several years. But then suddenly the policy changed again and companies had to rush back in. Radico, for instance, was able to add 15% to their growth just because they were able to enter Andhra Pradesh. Another example here is Uttar Pradesh, where a new rule allowed shops to sell both beer and liquor instead of choosing just one, and this instantly expanded Radico's reach by 40%. But that said, sometimes the tussle between the government and businesses prices turns very ugly. In Telangana, for instance, United Breweries refused to supply beer because the government-controlled distributor had not raised prices in many years. Eventually, the government had to come back to the table to renegotiate. And all of this gets even messier during the period of elections. Liquor sales are often curbed or restricted around the voting season. In Rajasthan, for example, United Breweries had a distribution system that involved moving beer across state borders. But during the Lok Sabha elections, the borders were closed. And as a result, the company lost about 10% of market share in just one single month simply because it could not supply beer on time. So the question then is, how do companies even survive in such a tricky environment? The answer actually seems to be to stay close to power. I'll explain what I mean here. See, many companies are now lobbying much harder than they ever had before. United Breweries recently launched the Beer Association of India, which is a new industry body aimed at engaging with state governments, putting forward the industry's point of view, and also fighting for fairer regulations. And that is the real story of India's alcohol market. It's honestly not just a story of margins or volumes like many other companies. It's actually a constant negotiation between ambition and constraint, between what customers want, what governments allow, and what brands can pull off. That brings me to the end of the first story. Let's now move on and talk about the second story. See, on the 26th of May, something very interesting happened in India. Now, most of us would not have noticed it, but in the field of electricity, it was a kind of moment that makes you sit up and take notice. Electricity prices on India's power exchange suddenly crashed almost to zero. Not low, mind you, almost free. Between 9 am and 11 pm, power was selling at just 11 paise per kilowatt hour. And to put that into some perspective for you, that is lower than the exchange's own transaction fee, and that means sellers were practically giving away electricity to everybody. Now the thing is, of course, that's not normally how things work, right? So what's exactly going on? To understand this, let's first quickly look at how electricity is typically bought and sold in India, because that serves as a good primer for us to understand what exactly happened. See, most of the power that we use every day, whether at home or at work, does not come from some open marketplace, obviously. Instead, it actually comes through long-term contracts. These are called power purchase agreements, or PPAs. Now, in a PPA, an electricity generator, let's say a coal plant or a solar park, agrees to supply a certain amount of power to a distribution company or DISCOM at a fixed price, usually for a several-year period. Now, these DISCOMs are the ones who usually deliver electricity to homes and offices like yours and mine. But there's a catch here. These PPAs are structured in a way where the buyer, which is the DISCOM in this case, has to pay for the electricity whether they end up using it or not. And that is how the majority of India's power system works. It's basically locked in, stable, and also predictable. But then there is also a smaller part of the market that works a little differently here. This is a short-term or spot market, which is a kind of real-time trading platform for electricity of sorts. This is a part of the system that accounts for almost 15% of India's electricity consumption. And within that, the spot market, which is run by exchanges like the Indian Energy Exchange or the IEX and Power Exchange India Limited, makes up about 8%. Now here, the rules are more like a free market. Every day, power generators, who is anybody who has excess electricity, puts in their bids to sell. And on the other side, buyers, who are usually DISCOMs or large industrial users, put in bids to buy. It's very simple. Now the exchange basically matches supply and demand, starting with the cheapest bids, working its way up until the day's demand is completely met. So the price that gets settled eventually is called the market clearing price. That price keeps changing throughout the day based on how much electricity is available and how much is actually required. Now fast forward, on that Monday in the month of May, for a few hours in the middle of the day, something very unusual happened. The market clearing price dropped to 11 paise, which, like I said earlier, is virtually zero. And that brings us to the real question behind this story, which is solar power. See, India has seen a massive boom in solar energy over the last few years. Huge solar parks have come up in sunny states like Rajasthan and Gujarat. And during the middle of the day, when the sun is at its strongest, these solar panels generate tens of gigawatts of electricity, which is enough to light up entire states altogether. But the problem is that people do not need most of the electricity when the sun is the brightest. In fact, demand actually drops in the middle of the day in most cases. Factories and offices are already running, homes are mostly empty, air conditioners, lights, and TVs, which are the things that drive household power use, only really start working during the evening hours. So this very simple mismatch between when electricity is available and when it is actually required is what causes prices to crash. I mean, imagine a river of free solar power flooding the system during noon hours, but no one is around to use it in the first place. The market obviously gets oversupplied, demand does not rise as fast enough, and prices collapse as a result of it. Now, this effect is so common in solar-rich regions that energy experts have a name for the graph that it creates, which is called the duck curve. See, when you plot electricity demand throughout the day, it dips in the afternoon hours like a duck's back, and then it suddenly rises in the evening like a duck's neck. Basically, the more solar power you have, the deeper that midday dip becomes. But there is another twist to this story. See, solar and wind energy have been classified as must-run resources in India. That means grid operators cannot simply switch them off when there is too much power in the system. So all that solar electricity keeps flowing in whether it is needed or not. And because conventional power plants like coal or gas plants cannot just turn off and on like a switch, some of them also have to keep running. And the result is massive oversupply, and as a result, prices crash. In places like Europe or the US, these midday prices do not just fall to zero, sometimes they even go negative. You heard that right? Producers actually pay somebody to take electricity off their hands. It sounds bizarre to be honest, but there is actually a logic behind it. See, for some power plants, especially nuclear or coal, shutting down and restarting is expensive and very slow. And honestly, it's cheaper to actually keep running and take a small loss on the price than to actually switch it off completely. Now, in India, of course, we have not seen negative prices yet, but this May was a very clear sign that we are definitely headed in that direction and we might see it very soon. So all that said and done, of course, zero price electricity does sound like a great thing because who would not want free power, right? But there's actually a problem here, and it's a very big problem. Let me start with the solar developers. See, many of them do not have long-term PPAs. They depend on earning revenue by selling on the spot market. But if that very market keeps collapsing to zero during sunny hours, they just cannot recover their investments. And over time, they will go bankrupt or they will have to exit the business. And that slows down the solar transition of the world. Then comes the discoms. Imagine a state electricity board that is paying 2.5 rupees per unit to a solar producer under the PPA. But when they go to sell that power on the exchange, they only get 0.1 rupee per unit. Now that is a direct loss of 2.4 rupees for every single unit that they sell. And these losses eventually pile up and either get passed on to consumers through higher tariffs or the government ends up paying through subsidies. But either way, somebody at the end of the day has to bear the cost. Now traditional power plants also suffer here. Coal and gas plants rely on running for a certain number of hours a day in order to stay profitable, like I just mentioned. But if solar eats into their market during the day, they also end up generating less and also as a result earning less. So if too many of them shut down, we risk not having enough backup when solar or wind is not available. But there is also a big geographical divide over here. See, states like Rajasthan, Gujarat and Tamil Nadu, which usually have a lot of solar, are now producing more electricity than they can use. But because midday prices are falling, they are earning lesser from it. But on the other hand, power importing states like Delhi or Maharashtra, for example, are benefiting from cheap solar power that is being sent to them. But again, this creates a big dependency. If it is cloudy in Rajasthan, for example, everyone downstream feels the pinch. So the question then becomes, what is the solution of this? See, the most obvious answer is also the most difficult one, that is storage. See, if you can store all the excess solar power during the day and eventually use it in the evening when the demand peaks, you will be able to solve the duck curve problem very simply. And batteries are obviously the most promising way to do that. But the problem then is that India simply does not have enough of them. As of March 2024, India had only around 220 megawatt hours of battery storage installed. Now that is really tiny as compared to thousands of megawatts of solar power being generated every single day. The government says that we need about 74 gigawatts of storage by 2032 so that we can properly support our renewable goals. That is over 300 times what we currently have. Now the technology exists, but it's still expensive. Batteries need a solid business case to be viable, where the difference between the cheapest and the costliest electricity during the day is big enough to justify the investment. And while global battery prices have dropped, China in particular has driven down costs by over 90% in the last decade, and they are still not cheap enough for India's price-sensitive market. But that said, there are also a few other ways to store energy. For instance, pumped hydro storage works by pushing water uphill when electricity is cheap and letting it flow back down through turbines when the power is expensive. Now, India already has about 4.7 gigawatt of pumped hydro and is working on adding a lot more. But it's not going to be enough on its own, to be honest. But even beyond storage, policymakers are currently trying out some other tools as well. One of them is time of day pricing. See, some states are experimenting with making electricity cheaper during midday hours so that they can encourage people to run their washing machines, charge their electric vehicles, or cool their buildings when solar power is abundant. But that said, it's not really easy to get people to change their habits, right? Most people are not even at home in the afternoon, and they may not really care about slight price differences in some cases. Another solution is improving our grid infrastructure. Now, for this, the government is building transmission lines that can move solar power from sunny states to places that actually require it. Projects like the Green Energy Corridor is aimed at laying down thousands of kilometers of new new lines by the year 2026. But this kind of work is expensive, it is slow, and it is often stuck in regulatory delays. There are also discussions about reforming the electricity market itself. One idea is capacity payments, where power plants are paid not for the electricity they generate, but simply for being available when needed, sort of like a retainer fee of sorts. Now, this could help keep coal and gas plants viable even if they run for fewer hours. And finally, the government is offering incentives to push for battery adoption. There are subsidies, funding schemes, and even mandates to include storage in new renewable projects. But to be honest, progress here has been slightly on the slower side, mostly because costs remain high and the regulatory environment is still almost evolving. And mind you, what's happening in India here is not really unique. The same thing is playing out in solar heavy regions around the entire world. In 2024, for example, California saw negative prices during 13% of the year in its southern regions. Another example is Australia, which had even more. Some of its states had negative prices almost for a quarter of the time. Germany, which is a pioneer in renewables, clocked 475 hours in negative prices in 2024, which was up from 301 a year before. There's also a very interesting instance here. In May 2025, during a particularly sunny public holiday, prices in Germany plunged to negative 250 euros per megawatt hour. In Belgium, it fell even lower to a negative 462 euros. Now, all of these cases basically follow the exact same pattern. When the sun shines and the weather is mild, solar generation peaks and demand drops, crashing prices. Now, India is heading down the exact same path. We've set an ambitious target of 500 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030, which is more than double of what we have today. And that's a good thing, but we are also reaching a point where our biggest challenge is success itself. The sun is giving us more energy than we know what to do with, and the real question is whether we'll be able to store it, share it, and make the most of it. Because if we do not figure that out soon, we might ending up wasting the very thing that we worked so hard to build as a society. That brings me to the end of the two stories of the day. With that, let's move on to the final section and talk about the quick news headline. First, India is set to produce a record 117.5 million metric tons of wheat in the crop year ending June 2025, surpassing the Farm Ministry's earlier estimate of 115.4 million tons. The rise is attributed to farmers expanding cultivation of high-yielding seed varieties in response to higher market prices. Second, Bajaj Auto has raised concerns over potential EV production disruptions due to delays in the import of rare earth magnets from China. In its latest earnings call, the company said that if the issue is not resolved, its EV manufacturing could be impacted by July 2025. For your context, the magnets which are essential for electric motors have been held at Chinese ports since 4th of April following a change in China's export policy requiring end-use declarations. Third and the final one for the day, India's defense production touched an all-time high of 1.46 trillion rupees in FY 2025, marking a 15% rise from 1.27 trillion rupees in FY 2024, according to the Ministry of Defense. Defense exports also reached a new peak of 24,000 crore rupees, up 14% year over year from 21,083 crore rupees. That's all the news and stories I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the show. This is your host Anurag Bansal signing off. Take care and goodbye. Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.